Moscow, Idaho. A town of just over 25,000 people, nestled in the rolling hills of the Palouse. It is a place where life moves slowly, where neighbors know one another, and where the idea of violent crime seems distant. Something that happens in other places, in bigger cities, in the kinds of towns people lock their doors at night without thinking twice. But here in Moscow, the University of Idaho is the heartbeat of the community. Students walk freely. The streets are lined with coffee shops and bookstores, and families have spent generations believing in the town's safety. That belief would shatter on the morning of November 13th, 2022. At approximately 11:58 a.m., a 911 call was placed from a house on King Road, a residence known to many on campus as a hub of activity. A place where students gathered, where laughter was a constant presence, where the nights were long and the friendships even longer. But on this morning, there was no laughter, no voices spilling into the street, only a silence thick with something unseen, an absence, an unshakable rawness that hung in the air. The call to authorities was vague. The dispatcher was told that someone inside was unresponsive. But when first responders arrived, they encountered something far worse than anyone could have imagined. Inside the home, 4 University of Idaho students were found dead. Their names would soon become known across the nation: Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. All brutally murdered in the early morning hours while the rest of the world had been asleep. Their lives stolen in an act of violence so sudden, so incomprehensible, that even seasoned investigators would later admit it was unlike anything they had ever seen. Word spread quickly. Before police could release a statement, before the families could even be notified, the small town of Moscow was already stirring with fear. In a place where violent crime was almost non-existent, where the last recorded homicide had occurred years earlier, the idea that 4 students could be slaughtered in their own home felt impossible. And yet, it was real. The details of the crime scene were not immediately disclosed. But rumors began to swirl, whispers of a knife attack, of blood seeping through walls, of a scene so gruesome that first responders had been visibly shaken. Parents of University of Idaho students, some thousands of miles away, began calling their children, urging them to stay indoors, to leave town if they could. But the most unsettling question remained unanswered. Who had done this? And why? Police assured the public that there was no immediate threat. But in a town where the doors were often left unlocked, where trust had never been in question, fear took root. Because if someone was capable of committing such an atrocity, and they had not yet been caught, that meant they were still out there. Somewhere in Moscow, Idaho, a killer walked free. It was a house like any other, a 3-story, 6-bedroom home, perched on a quiet street just off campus. A place meant for late-night study sessions, movie marathons, and the kind of unforgettable memories that define college life. But on the morning of November 13, 2022, it became something else entirely. A crime scene that would haunt an entire nation. Inside, the silence was deafening. The walls, once covered in photos of smiling faces, now bore witness to something unspeakable. The first officers to arrive at the scene would later struggle to describe what they found. Some would say it was the most disturbing thing they had ever encountered in their careers. Others could only shake their heads, their eyes betraying the horror of what lay beyond those doors. 4 young lives ended in the dark hours before dawn. Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen, best friends since childhood, were found together on the 3rd floor. Their bond had been unbreakable in life, and now, even in death, they remained side by side. Downstairs, Xana Kernodle and her boyfriend Ethan Chapin had met the same fate. The attacks had been brutal, swift, and deliberate. The weapon, later confirmed to be a fixed-blade knife, had left no room for survival. But the most chilling detail? 2 other roommates had been inside the house that night. 2 young women asleep in their rooms, unaware that just feet away, their friends were being murdered. When they awoke, the horror was already over. The 911 call was placed from one of their phones. Initial reports suggested that they had discovered an unconscious person, perhaps assuming their friend had simply passed out after a long night. But the truth would reveal itself in an instant. As law enforcement stepped inside, it became clear this was no accident, no medical emergency. This was a massacre. The crime scene was chaotic, yet disturbingly precise. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no kicked-in doors. Whoever had done this had walked inside with purpose, moved through the house with confidence, and disappeared just as easily. And then, another unsettling realization: despite the sheer brutality of the crime, no one had heard a thing. No screams, no struggles loud enough to wake the other roommates. How could 4 people be killed in the dead of night, in a house full of young, healthy college students, without anyone noticing? The community wanted answers. The victims' families demanded them. But as investigators scoured the scene, piecing together the fragments of that horrifying night, one thing became painfully clear. This was only the beginning. The town of Moscow, Idaho, had never experienced a crime like this before. 4 students, murdered in their sleep. A crime scene so brutal that seasoned detectives struggled to contain their emotions. And yet, in the days that followed, there were no arrests, no suspects, no clear explanation for how or why this had happened. Panic took hold. Students packed their bags and left town before Thanksgiving break, some never returning. Parents called the university, demanding answers. Who could have done this? Was the killer still nearby? Was this a random attack, or had the victims been targeted? The police assured the public that there was no immediate threat. But how could that be true when the person responsible was still out there? Detectives worked around the clock, combing through the crime scene, collecting every possible shred of evidence. But the lack of a clear suspect made the case even more difficult. There were no known enemies, no obvious grudges. The victims had been well-liked, active on campus, social. If this was a crime of passion, who would have had reason to commit such a horrific act? If it was a break-in, why had nothing been stolen? There were too many questions and not enough answers. Then, a breakthrough. Police turned to surveillance footage from nearby homes and businesses. They weren't sure what they were looking for until they saw it. A white Hyundai Elantra passing by the King Road house multiple times in the early morning hours of November 13. It didn't belong to any of the victims. No one could explain why it was there, but the car had a distinct shape, a unique profile. If they could find that vehicle, they might find the killer. Meanwhile, forensic evidence from the crime scene was being processed. Among the items collected, a tan leather knife sheath found on a bed next to one of the victims. It was a chilling discovery. The weapon itself was missing, but the sheath bore something far more valuable: DNA. A single trace, just enough to be tested. The police had their first real lead, but finding a match would take time. The weeks passed, and the fear in Moscow only grew stronger. The lack of updates, the absence of a suspect, the thought that someone capable of such violence might be walking among them. It was enough to make the town feel like a place they no longer recognized. Some wondered if the case would ever be solved. But behind the scenes, investigators were closing in. They had the DNA, they had the car, and soon, they would have a name. As days turned to weeks, frustration grew. The public demanded answers. National media descended on Moscow, amplifying the pressure on law enforcement. Every detail of the case was dissected on television, in newspapers, and across social media. But behind the scenes, investigators were meticulously piecing together the puzzle. The white Hyundai Elantra had become their strongest lead. Surveillance footage showed it circling the crime scene multiple times in the early morning hours of November 13th, just before the murders. It was seen driving away at high speed, minutes after the estimated time of death. Investigators traced its movements through traffic and security cameras, following its path across state lines. The car had vanished, but it wouldn't stay hidden for long. Meanwhile, forensic analysts had been working on the DNA found on the knife sheath left at the scene. It was a small amount, barely enough to test, but science didn't need much. With no immediate match in law enforcement databases, investigators turned to an increasingly powerful tool: genetic genealogy. By comparing the unknown DNA sample to publicly available ancestry databases, they were able to construct a family tree, a lineage leading back to a single person. Bryan Kohberger, a 28-year-old PhD student studying criminology at Washington State University, just a short drive from Moscow. A man who had no direct connection to the victims. A man who had seemingly been living an ordinary life, while an entire town remained paralyzed in fear. Investigators learned that Kohberger had driven across the country to Pennsylvania shortly after the murders. The white Hyundai Elantra. His white Hyundai Elantra had been with him. FBI agents began tracking his movements, watching as he and his father went about their lives, seemingly unaware that law enforcement was closing in. Then, a final confirmation. Agents retrieved DNA from the trash outside Kohberger's parents' home. When tested, it was a near-perfect match to the sample found at the crime scene. The case had been built, piece by piece. And on December 30th, 2022, a team of officers moved in. At approximately 3 a.m., in a quiet neighborhood in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, a SWAT team breached the Kohberger family home. Within moments, Bryan Kohberger was in custody. The man accused of the brutal killings of 4 students, who had studied criminal behavior, who had analyzed the very tactics law enforcement would use against him, was now about to face the full weight of justice. But for the victims' families, for the shaken community of Moscow, Idaho, one question still remained. Why? The early morning darkness was interrupted by the flashing lights of police vehicles. In Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, a quiet suburban home became the center of a high-stakes operation. A SWAT team moved in swiftly, executing a meticulously planned raid. Their target, 28-year-old Bryan Kohberger. Inside, Kohberger slept, unaware that his time as a free man was about to end. At approximately 3 a.m., officers breached the residence. They moved through the house methodically, their weapons drawn, prepared for anything. But there was no struggle, no desperate attempt to escape. Kohberger was taken into custody without incident. As he was led away in handcuffs, his expression was unreadable, neither shock nor fear, just a blank stare, as though his mind was already somewhere else. For weeks, he had lived as if nothing had happened. He had driven across the country with his father, reportedly discussing everyday topics like traffic stops and travel plans. He had spent time in his parents' home, eating meals, sleeping in his childhood bedroom, while an entire nation searched for the person responsible for the brutal murders of 4 students. And yet, the evidence against him was mounting. The white Hyundai Elantra, now parked outside his parents' house, was the same vehicle seen near the crime scene on the night of the murders. His phone records placed him in the area of the King Road house on multiple occasions before the killings, suggesting he had stalked the victims beforehand. And then there was the DNA, the crucial, undeniable link. In Idaho, authorities were ready. Kohberger was quickly charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. But even as prosecutors prepared their case, one question loomed over everything. Would Kohberger confess? In custody, he remained silent. He did not ask why he was being arrested. He did not proclaim his innocence or guilt. Instead, he waited, observing. Cold, calculating. He had studied criminal behavior for years, fascinated by the minds of killers. And now, the world would examine him in the same way. When news of his arrest broke, the reaction was immediate. For the victims' families, it was a moment of relief. Justice was finally within reach. For the town of Moscow, it was a reminder that their worst fears had been justified. The monster had been real. And for the world, a chilling realization set in. The man accused of these horrific crimes had been hiding in plain sight, studying the very system that had now caught him. Who was Bryan Kohberger? In the days following his arrest, the world scrambled to understand the man accused of one of the most horrifying crimes in recent history. He was not an ex-boyfriend seeking revenge. He was not a drifter or a known criminal. He was something far more unsettling, a graduate student in criminology, someone who'd spent years studying crime, policing, and the psychology of killers. Kohberger had grown up in Pennsylvania, an ordinary student in an ordinary town. But those who knew him in his younger years described a man who had changed over time. He had struggled with his weight as a teenager, later transforming his body through intense dieting and exercise. But with that transformation came something else, an air of superiority, an obsession with control. Former classmates recalled his cold, analytical nature. He was highly intelligent but socially awkward, speaking in ways that made others uncomfortable. Some described him as arrogant, eager to assert his intellectual dominance in conversations. Others remembered something darker, his fascination with criminals, with violent offenders, with the minds of those who killed without remorse. At Washington State University, where he was pursuing his PhD in criminology, Kohberger immersed himself in the study of crime. He had even posted surveys online, asking criminals to describe their thought processes. How did they choose their victims? How did they plan their attacks? What did they feel afterward? And yet, as investigators pieced together his background, one question remained unanswered. What had led him to commit such an act? Kohberger had no known connection to the victims. They had never interacted on campus, never exchanged messages, at least none that had been publicly discovered. But phone records showed something disturbing. He had been near the King Road house multiple times in the months leading up to the murders. Sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes during the day. He had been watching them, studying them. Had he chosen them at random, or had he fixated on them for a reason only he understood? Those closest to him never saw it coming. His professors had found him highly intelligent, though at times difficult. His classmates recalled debates where he seemed deeply invested in the mechanics of crime. He had even spoken in class about forensic evidence, crime scene analysis, and how police track suspects. And yet, if he had thought he was smart enough to get away with murder, he had underestimated those hunting him. Now the criminology student who had once studied killers was about to become a case study himself. And the world was watching. As Bryan Kohberger sat in custody, silent and expressionless, prosecutors began assembling the case that would be used to convict him. It was not just about proving he was capable of committing such a crime. It was about proving, beyond any doubt, that he was the only one who could have done it. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The DNA on the knife sheath. Perhaps the most damning piece of evidence was the tan leather knife sheath found next to one of the victims' bodies. It was an oversight, a mistake that would unravel everything. The sheath belonging to a military-style crowbar knife bore a single trace of male DNA. DNA that would later match a sample taken from Kohberger's family trash in Pennsylvania. It was forensic proof that he had been at the crime scene. The white Hyundai Elantra surveillance footage placed a white Hyundai Elantra near the King Road house multiple times in the early morning hours of November 13th, just before and after the murders. The car was traced across multiple security cameras, moving erratically, appearing and disappearing in the quiet streets of Moscow. When investigators connected the vehicle to Kohberger, the pieces began to fall into place. His car had been stopped by police in Indiana just weeks after the killings, during his cross-country trip home. The FBI had been watching him even then, waiting for the right moment to strike. Cell phone records and stalking behavior. Kohberger's phone had been near the victim's house at least 12 times before the murders, dating back months. Many of these visits occurred late at night, suggesting he had been watching them, studying their routines, and planning his crime. And then, there was the most chilling detail of all. On the morning of the murders, between 9:12 and 9:21 a.m., Kohberger's phone returned to the area of the crime scene, hours after the killings had taken place. Had he come back to see the aftermath, to watch police respond, to make sure no mistakes had been made? The surviving roommate's testimony. One of the most haunting revelations came from one of the surviving roommates. In a police affidavit, she described hearing muffled voices in the early morning hours, followed by crying, followed by something even more terrifying, a deep, chilling male voice saying, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." Then she saw him, a masked figure, dressed in black, walking past her room. She stood frozen, unable to move, as the intruder slipped out into the night. She had seen the killer with her own eyes. Kohberger's suspicious behavior. After the murders. Following the crime, Kohberger returned to his normal routine, attending classes at Washington State University, grading papers, even discussing the case with his fellow criminology students. But investigators noted several disturbing behaviors. He had thoroughly cleaned his car, seemingly aware of the forensic evidence that might remain. He had taken careful steps to avoid leaving a digital footprint after the murders, even turning off his phone at crucial moments. And then there was his trip home to Pennsylvania. Had he thought he was in the clear? Had he believed he was smarter than law enforcement? If so, he was wrong. As investigators connected these pieces, it became clear. Kohberger had not committed a random act of violence. This had been planned, calculated, and now he would face justice. What goes through the mind of a person capable of such brutality? As Bryan Kohberger sat behind bars awaiting trial, experts in criminal psychology began dissecting his behavior, his past, and his potential motives. Was he a killer driven by rage, a student attempting the perfect crime, or something even more chilling, a man who simply wanted to know what it felt like to take a life? A life obsessed with crime. From an early age, Kohberger had been fascinated by crime and the criminal mind. He had studied forensic psychology, policing tactics, and criminological theories, not as a law enforcement officer, but as an academic, an observer. Some who knew him described his obsession as detached, as if crime was just a puzzle to be solved, a concept rather than a reality. But for others, the warning signs had been there all along. In online forums, Kohberger had once posted about his struggles with mental health, describing feelings of detachment, of watching himself from outside his body. He spoke about a lack of emotion, an inability to feel joy or connection. Over time, these feelings may have deepened, evolving into something far more dangerous, a need to control, to dominate, to experience power in its most violent form. The need for control. People who knew Kohberger described him as arrogant, someone who believed he was always the smartest person in the room. He often corrected others, belittled them, and debated endlessly, not out of curiosity, but to assert his intellectual superiority. This need for control extended to his personal life. His strict diet, his rigid routines, his intense focus on academics, all signs of someone desperate to maintain dominance over his own mind and body. But was it enough? Did he seek a greater challenge? A more dangerous game? Did he see himself as the perfect criminal? Some speculated that Kohberger may have seen this crime as an experiment, his own test of everything he had studied. He had researched the minds of killers, understood forensic science, and knew how investigations were conducted. But knowledge and execution are not the same. Despite his education, Kohberger had made critical mistakes. He had left DNA evidence behind. He had driven his own car to the scene. He had stalked the victims in a way that left a digital trail. Had he believed he was too smart to be caught? Had he thought police wouldn't connect the dots? Or had he been so blinded by his own arrogance that he never considered the possibility of failure? The chilling calm of a suspected killer. Perhaps the most unnerving aspect of Kohberger's profile was his complete lack of emotion. During his arrest, he did not resist, did not ask questions, did not express surprise. Even in court, as he faced the families of the victims, he remained eerily calm, no remorse, no anger, nothing. What does it mean when someone commits a crime so violent, yet feels nothing at all? Forensic psychologists debated whether Kohberger fit the profile of a psychopath, a man who could dissociate from the gravity of his own actions, who could view human life as nothing more than a variable in an experiment. But there was one truth no one could deny. Whatever had driven Bryan Kohberger, whatever had led him down this dark path, he was no longer an observer of crime. He was now the subject of study. As the world processed the shocking details of the case, Bryan Kohberger sat in a jail cell, awaiting the legal battle that would determine his fate. For the prosecution, the case was clear. DNA evidence, cell phone records, surveillance footage, and behavioral patterns all pointed to Kohberger as the murderer. But this would not be an open and shut case. Kohberger had hired an experienced defense attorney, and he was not planning to confess. Instead, he would fight. Kohberger's first court appearance. On January 5, 2023, Kohberger appeared in an Idaho courtroom for the first time. Shackled, dressed in an orange jumpsuit, he walked in with the same cold, emotionless stare that had already unsettled the public. The judge read the charges: 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of felony burglary. If convicted, he faced the death penalty. And yet, there was no visible reaction from Kohberger. No signs of fear, remorse, or even confusion. He spoke only to acknowledge his rights, his voice quiet but clear. He did not enter a plea. But one thing was certain. This trial would be a fight to the end. The defense strategy: Kohberger's defense team knew the weight of the evidence against him. The prosecution had a strong case, but the defense had one advantage: reasonable doubt. They would argue that DNA evidence, while compelling, did not prove he committed the murders. The knife sheath could have been placed there by someone else. They would question the reliability of the surviving roommate's testimony. In a moment of extreme trauma, could she be certain about what she saw? They would scrutinize the cell phone records, suggesting that just because Kohberger had been near the crime scene before the murders didn't mean he was stalking the victims. Most of all, they would challenge the timeline, the methodology of the investigation, and the motives of law enforcement, anything that could weaken the state's case. The prosecution's case. For the prosecution, the goal was simple: prove that Kohberger had planned, executed, and attempted to cover up the brutal killings. They would present forensic experts to explain how DNA evidence was collected and why it was an undeniable match. They would show hours of security footage proving that Kohberger's car had been at the crime scene and then fled in the early morning hours. They would call witnesses, digital forensics analysts, and law enforcement officers to paint a picture of Kohberger as a methodical, calculating killer who had made crucial mistakes. The families in the courtroom. As Kohberger sat in silence, the families of the victims filled the courtroom, their grief now transformed into a search for justice. Some refused to look at him. Others stared directly at him, as if trying to find answers in the eyes of the man accused of taking their loved ones. The trial hadn't even begun, but the battle lines were drawn. The world was watching. And in that quiet courtroom in Idaho, a single question echoed louder than any argument, any evidence, any testimony. Would justice be served? As the case against Bryan Kohberger moved forward, one issue loomed over everything: the possibility of the death penalty. In Idaho, capital punishment was on the table. Prosecutors had the option to seek the ultimate sentence, and for many, it seemed justified. The crime had been brutal, calculated, and left an entire town in fear. If the death penalty wasn't meant for cases like this, then what was it for? But the decision wasn't automatic. The prosecution's argument for death. To pursue the death penalty, the prosecution needed to prove that Kohberger met the legal requirements for capital punishment under Idaho law. They would argue that the murders were premeditated, cruel, and showed an extreme disregard for human life. They would emphasize the sheer brutality of the killings: 4 victims stabbed to death in the middle of the night, with no chance to fight back. They would highlight Kohberger's planning, his stalking behavior, and the way he attempted to cover his tracks. They would paint him as a predator, someone who saw human life as disposable, and for that, they would argue, he deserved the most severe punishment the law could provide. The defense's fight for life. Kohberger's defense team knew the stakes. If convicted and sentenced to death, their client could one day face lethal injection. Their goal wasn't just to create doubt about his guilt. It was also to humanize him, to present him as someone who, even if guilty, didn't deserve to die. They might introduce mitigating factors. His mental state. Was he suffering from an undiagnosed psychological disorder? His past. Was there something in his upbringing that shaped him into what he became? His ability to change. Would life in prison without parole serve justice just as well? Some defense attorneys in high-profile murder cases have used lingering doubt as a strategy. Even if the jury was convinced Kohberger committed the crime, was there a chance the investigation had flaws? Could a death sentence be a mistake? Public opinion divided. Outside the courtroom, the debate raged. Some believed that execution was the only true justice for the victims and their families. Others argued that a life sentence, knowing he would spend the rest of his days in isolation, never to harm again, was punishment enough. For the families of the victims, the decision was personal. Some wanted to see him put to death. Others struggled with the idea of another life being taken, even his. But in the end, it wouldn't be up to them. It would be up to the state. And as Kohberger sat in his cell, awaiting trial, one question remained unanswered. Would he live to see old age behind bars? Or would he die by the hand of the very system he had once studied so closely? The day had arrived. After months of speculation, evidence gathering, and legal maneuvering, Bryan Kohberger's trial was finally set to begin. The eyes of the nation turned to the courtroom in Idaho, where prosecutors and defense attorneys prepared for a battle that would decide his fate. The tension was suffocating. News cameras lined the streets outside the courthouse. The families of the victims took their seats, their faces a mixture of grief and determination. Kohberger, wearing a suit, sat at the defense table, his expression unreadable. The judge entered. The jury was seated, and the case that had gripped the country was about to unfold. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out the horror of that night. The premeditation, the brutality, the sheer senselessness of the killings. They detailed Kohberger's movements in the weeks before the murders, his alleged stalking of the victims, and the forensic evidence that tied him to the crime. This was not an act of impulse. This was not a random break-in. This was cold, calculated, and deliberate, and we will prove it. The defense, in response, urged the jury to keep an open mind. They questioned the reliability of the evidence, arguing that the DNA on the knife sheath did not prove he was the killer. They suggested that the investigation had been rushed, that law enforcement had focused on Kohberger too soon, ignoring other possibilities. This case is built on circumstantial evidence and assumptions. We will show that the state has not met the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And just like that, the trial had begun. The prosecution's case. Over the next several days, the prosecution called witness after witness. Crime scene experts described the gruesome details of the attack. Detectives walked the jury through the timeline, presenting security footage of Kohberger's car near the crime scene. But the most compelling moment came when forensic analysts took the stand. The DNA evidence was clear. Kohberger's genetic profile matched the sample found on the knife sheath. The jury listened in silence as the expert explained the probability of that DNA belonging to anyone else. 1 in trillions. The surviving roommate's testimony. Then the courtroom fell into an eerie silence as the surviving roommate took the stand. Her voice was unsteady, her hands trembling as she recounted the terror of that night. She described the muffled cries, the strange noises, the masked man walking past her in the dark hallway. For the jury, this was no longer just evidence and legal arguments. This was real. This was fear. The defense's counterattack. When it was their turn, Kohberger's attorneys pushed back. They hammered at the lack of direct evidence. No murder weapon had been found. No video footage captured the actual crime. No clear motive had been established. They called forensic experts of their own, questioning the reliability of the DNA testing. They suggested that Kohberger's DNA could have been transferred onto the knife sheath in some other way. They argued that the surviving roommate's memory, formed under extreme distress, could not be taken as absolute truth. Most of all, they planted seeds of doubt. And in a trial like this, doubt could mean the difference between life and death. Kohberger's decision? Will he testify? As the trial neared its climax, one question remained. Would Kohberger take the stand in his own defense? His attorneys knew the risk. A single misstep under cross-examination could destroy any hope of reasonable doubt. And Kohberger himself? He remained silent, his face unreadable, as the courtroom waited for the decision. The verdict was approaching, and soon, the world would know whether Bryan Kohberger would walk free, spend life in prison, or face the death chamber. The air in the courtroom was suffocating. The prosecution had laid out its case with cold precision. DNA evidence, cell phone records, security footage, and the chilling testimony of a survivor. The defense had done its best to chip away at the certainty, highlighting gaps, questioning forensic procedures, and arguing that reasonable doubt still remained. But now, it was no longer in their hands. The prosecution had made its final argument. The evidence does not lie. Bryan Kohberger planned these murders. He carried them out, and he left behind a trail of proof that points to no one else. The defense had responded, "Is this justice, or is this a rush to judgment?" The state wants you to believe they have a perfect case, but the truth is, there are still too many unanswered questions. Now the jury had been sent to deliberate. Inside the jury room, 12 men and women, sworn to uphold justice, sat in a small room, faces tense, eyes scanning the mountain of evidence laid before them. They had to decide, was Bryan Kohberger guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? One juror spoke first. "The DNA on the knife sheath is huge. That's not a coincidence." Another countered, "But there's no murder weapon. We're just supposed to assume he did it." Back and forth they went, weighing the facts, the arguments, the stakes. Some were ready to convict immediately. Others wanted to go over every detail again, one more time. And then there was the bigger question. If guilty, should he face life in prison or death? The families wait outside the jury room. The families of the victims sat in silence. Some prayed, others clenched their fists. The weight was unbearable. For them, the evidence had already told the story. Their loved ones had suffered a horrific, senseless fate. And the man accused of carrying out that crime sat just feet away, his fate undecided. Would justice finally be served? Kohberger's final moments before the verdict. In his holding cell, Bryan Kohberger sat alone, awaiting the jury's decision. For months, he had remained expressionless, silent, calculating, unshaken. But now the weight of his future bore down on him. Would he spend the rest of his life behind bars, or would he be sentenced to death? No one knew what truly went through his mind in those final moments before the verdict. But soon, the courtroom doors would open, the jury would return, and the world would finally have an answer. The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the kind that carries the weight of finality. The kind that makes even the sound of a breath feel deafening. The judge entered. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Some looked straight ahead. Others kept their eyes on the floor. Bryan Kohberger sat still, his hands folded in front of him. His expression was the same as it had been since the beginning, calm, emotionless. But inside, no one knew what he was feeling. The judge turned to the jury. Has the jury reached a verdict? A pause. Then the foreman stood. We have, Your Honor. The families of the victims gripped each other's hands. Some closed their eyes, bracing for what was about to come. Others stared at Kohberger, unblinking, waiting for his reaction, if there would be one at all. The foreman's voice was steady. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Madison Mogen, we find the defendant guilty. A quiet gasp rippled through the courtroom. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Kaylee Goncalves, we find the defendant guilty. Kohberger remained motionless. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Xana Kernodle, we find the defendant guilty. One of the victim's mothers began to weep. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Ethan Chapin, we find the defendant guilty. The silence in the courtroom became suffocating. The judge nodded, then turned to Kohberger. You have been found guilty on all charges. The court will now move to the sentencing phase. Still, Kohberger did not react. No shaking hands, no tearful breakdown, no anger. Just the same cold stare, as if this trial had been happening to someone else. But for the families in that courtroom, for the people of Moscow, Idaho, and for a nation that had been watching, this was not just another case. This was justice, or at least the closest thing to it. But one question remained. Would Bryan Kohberger spend the rest of his life behind bars, or would he be sentenced to die? With the guilty verdict delivered, the trial moved into its final stage, the sentencing. The state of Idaho allowed for the death penalty, but it was not automatic. The decision now lay in the hands of the jury. Would Bryan Kohberger live out his days in a prison cell, or would he face the ultimate punishment? The prosecution wasted no time in making their case. The prosecution's argument for death. This crime was not only heinous, it was calculated. It was monstrous. It was the definition of pure evil. The prosecutor's voice was steady but firm. They recounted the details that had horrified the nation, the stalking, the brutality, the complete lack of remorse. They reminded the jury that Kohberger had studied criminology, not to stop criminals, but to think like one. This man had every opportunity to turn away, to stop himself, but he didn't. He carried out these murders in cold blood, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable horror. If this case does not warrant the death penalty, then what does? The defense's plea for mercy. The defense, knowing Kohberger's life was on the line, took a different approach. They did not try to argue his innocence anymore. That battle was over. Instead, they argued that life in prison without the possibility of parole was a punishment worse than death. Bryan Kohberger will never be free again. He will never step outside prison walls, never experience life beyond steel bars. A death sentence is quick. Life in prison is a slow, unrelenting punishment. They pointed to his mental state, his past, the fact that there were still questions about why he had done it. Executing him will not bring the victims back. It will not undo the pain their families feel. But locking him away forever ensures that justice is served without making us take another life. The family's emotional testimonies. The most emotional part of the sentencing phase came when the families of the victims took the stand. One by one, they spoke of their loved ones, their smiles, their dreams, the future stolen from them. One mother, her voice shaking, said, "I wake up every morning and for just a second I forget. And then it hits me all over again. My child is gone, and he took her from me." A father, his face hard with grief, simply said, "There is no punishment severe enough for what he did." Some demanded the death penalty. Others struggled with the idea of another life being taken. But all of them wanted one thing: an end to the nightmare. The jury's final deliberation. Once again, the jury was sent to deliberate. This time, they weren't deciding guilt. They were deciding life or death. Some believed execution was the only way to serve justice. Others questioned whether a life spent in isolation, no control, no freedom, was an even worse fate. Hours passed, and then they returned to the courtroom, ready to deliver their final decision. Would Bryan Kohberger die by lethal injection, or would he live out his days in the darkness of a prison cell with nothing but time and regret? The courtroom fell silent for the last time. The judge turned to the jury. "Have you reached a decision?" The foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor." Bryan Kohberger sat motionless, his hands clasped in front of him. He had been found guilty. Now, he was about to learn whether he would spend the rest of his life in prison or face execution. The judge nodded. "Please read the verdict." The foreman's voice was clear, steady. For the murder of Madison Mogan, the jury recommends the death penalty. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. For the murder of Kaylee Goncalves, the jury recommends the death penalty. Tears filled the eyes of some family members. For the murder of Xana Kernodle, the jury recommends the death penalty. Kohberger remained still. For the murder of Ethan Chapin, the jury recommends the death penalty. The weight of the words settled over the room. It was final. The judge confirmed the sentence, his voice firm. "Bryan Kohberger, this court hereby sentences you to death." A wave of emotion spread through the courtroom. Some sighed in relief, others wept. The families clung to one another, knowing that while justice had been served, nothing could bring back the lives that had been stolen. Kohberger was led away, his fate sealed. The aftermath. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, reporters spoke into microphones, and the world reacted. For some, the verdict brought closure. For others, it raised new debates about justice, morality, and the death penalty itself. And for the small town of Moscow, Idaho, the nightmare that had haunted them for so long was finally over. But one question would remain forever unanswered. Why? Why had Bryan Kohberger done it? What had driven him to target 4 innocent students? What had gone through his mind that night? There would never be a satisfying answer, only a story that would be remembered for generations, a case that had shaken a town, a nation. And now it had reached its end. If you found this deep dive into the Bryan Kohberger trial compelling, make sure to subscribe for more in-depth true crime stories. We break down the cases that shock the world, bringing you the facts, the theories, and the truth behind the headlines. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next.